She woke up that morning with nothing more than a sore throat, a runny nose, the kind of ordinary illness that visits every household, that every parent has soothed 1,000 times before. Her father reached into the medicine cabinet, pulled out a familiar red and white bottle and handed his 12-year-old daughter a single capsule, a gesture of love, a moment of care. And within hours, Mary Kellerman was gone. This is a true story. Every name, every date, every terrible detail. And tonight I'm going to walk you through one of the most chilling, unsolved cases in American history, a crime so devastating that it changed the way we look at every product we bring into our homes, every pill we place on our tongues, every assumption we make about safety in our modern world. Before we begin this journey into the darkness, I want to ask something of you. This channel, The Midnight File, is a labor of love, a place where we honor the stories that deserve to be told and the victims who deserve to be remembered. We're working toward 100 subscribers, and if you find yourself drawn into this case, if these words stay with you after the screen goes dark, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that subscribe button. We're also hoping for 50 likes on this video, a small gesture that helps more people discover these forgotten files. And while you're listening, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know just how far these stories travel, which corners of the world are listening when the midnight hour arrives. Now, let me take you back to a time before tamper-proof seals, before shrink-wrapped bottles and foil barriers, back to September of 1982, when autumn was settling over the suburbs of Chicago, when the leaves were beginning to turn, and when 7 innocent people had no idea that their lives were about to intersect with something monstrous. The year was 1982. Ronald Reagan occupied the White House. E.T. the Extraterrestrial was breaking box office records. Michael Jackson was about to release Thriller. America felt in many ways like a nation at the height of its confidence, its prosperity, its sense of safety. The Cold War cast its shadow, yes, but in the quiet suburbs spreading out from Chicago's metropolitan heart, life moved at a gentler pace. Neighbors knew each other's names. Children walked to school. And when someone felt under the weather, they reached for a bottle of Tylenol, the most trusted over-the-counter pain reliever in the country. Johnson & Johnson had built an empire on that trust. Extra-strength Tylenol was a household staple, as common as aspirin, as familiar as the medicine cabinets that held them. Parents gave it to children. Workers took it for headaches. It was, in every sense, an unremarkable product, safe, reliable, ordinary. But someone, somewhere, was about to transform that ordinary bottle into an instrument of terror. Someone was about to prove that the most dangerous things aren't always the ones we fear, that sometimes the threat is sitting right there on the shelf, waiting to be chosen. Let me tell you about Elk Grove Village. It's a suburb about 25 miles northwest of downtown Chicago, a community of tree-lined streets and modest homes, where families put down roots and raised their children in the kind of quiet contentment that defines the American dream. In 1982, it was home to the Kellerman family, including their daughter Mary, a bright 7th grader with her whole life stretching out before her. On the morning of September 29th, Mary woke up feeling unwell, nothing alarming, just the beginnings of a cold, the kind of minor ailment that visits every household when the seasons change. She told her parents about her sore throat, her stuffy nose. Her father, wanting to ease her discomfort, did what millions of parents had done before him. He went to the medicine cabinet, retrieved a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol, and gave his daughter a single capsule. I want you to pause here with me. I want you to feel the weight of that moment. A father's simple act of care, a gesture of love so ordinary that it barely registers as significant. And yet, in that moment, everything changed. In that moment, without knowing it, a father handed his daughter something unthinkable. Within hours of taking that capsule, Mary collapsed on the bathroom floor. Her parents found her there, unresponsive, her young body failing in ways that made no sense for a child who had been perfectly healthy just the day before. They rushed her to Alexian Brothers Medical Center, praying, hoping, bargaining with whatever forces might listen. But by 9:30 that morning, Mary Kellerman was pronounced deceased. The doctors were baffled. A 12-year-old girl, dead from what appeared to be a stroke. It defied explanation. It defied everything they knew about medicine and probability, and the fragility of young life. They recorded her passing, noted the unusual circumstances, and moved on to the next patient, the next crisis, the next file on the stack. They had no way of knowing that Mary was the first, that somewhere else in the Chicago suburbs, the horror was already repeating itself. 10 miles away, in Arlington Heights, a young postal worker named Adam Janus was going about his day. Adam was 27 years old, a hard-working man with a gentle disposition, the kind of person who made time for family and looked forward to simple pleasures. That afternoon, he stopped at a grocery store to pick up a few items. Among his purchases was a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol. He also bought flowers, perhaps for someone he loved, perhaps just because the day felt right for such a gesture. We'll never know. When Adam got home, he was experiencing some minor discomfort, maybe a headache, maybe the beginnings of muscle aches. He opened the Tylenol bottle, shook 2 capsules into his palm, and swallowed them with water. Almost immediately, something went terribly wrong. Adam collapsed in his home, his body seizing, his consciousness fading. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, he was dead at the hospital, just hours after Mary Kellerman had taken her last breath in a different emergency room across the suburbs. The medical staff at Northwest Community Hospital recorded Adam's cause of death as a heart attack. A young man, seemingly healthy, struck down by cardiac failure. It was unusual, certainly, but not impossible. Hearts fail sometimes. Young people die sometimes. The doctors signed the papers and offered condolences to his grieving family. And this is where the story takes its most tragic turn. This is where one family's grief became a catalyst for unimaginable horror. Adam's family gathered at his home that afternoon to mourn. His younger brother Stanley, 25 years old, arrived with his wife Teresa, just 19, newlyweds still discovering the shape of their life together. The house filled with the sounds of sorrow, the hushed conversations that follow sudden loss, the desperate need to understand why someone so young had been taken so quickly. At some point during that gathering, Stanley complained of a headache, the stress perhaps, the shock of losing his brother. Teresa felt unwell too, the emotional toll manifesting as physical discomfort, and there on the counter or in the cabinet sat the bottle of Tylenol that Adam had purchased just hours before. The same bottle, the same capsules. Stanley took 2, Teresa took 2, and within minutes the nightmare doubled, then tripled. Both of them collapsed in the same house where Adam had fallen. Both of them were rushed to the same hospital that had just pronounced Adam deceased. Stanley died that same day, September 29th. Teresa fought for 2 more days before passing on October 1st, another young life extinguished. 3 members of the same family. 3 deaths in a matter of hours. From the same bottle. If you're feeling the weight of this story settling on your chest, if you're holding your breath as I speak these names, then you understand why this case haunts me. You understand why, after all these years, I keep returning to these files. And if stories like this stay with you too, consider subscribing to the Midnight File. Because the darkness doesn't end here, it's only just beginning. The deaths of the Janus family created a puzzle that couldn't be ignored. When one person dies suddenly, it's a tragedy. When 2 people in the same household die within hours of each other, it's a crisis. When 3 people from the same family all collapse after gathering together, it's something else entirely. It's a pattern, and patterns demand investigation. Arlington Heights had a village nurse named Helen Jensen, a woman whose job involved monitoring public health and investigating unusual medical events. When she learned about the Janus family deaths, something didn't sit right with her. 3 healthy young people, all dying in the same house, all within hours of each other. It didn't match any disease she knew, it didn't fit any contamination pattern she'd studied. But it did suggest one terrible possibility, something they all shared, something they all consumed. Jensen visited the Janus household. She walked through the rooms where 3 people had collapsed, looking for connections, looking for clues. And then she noticed the Tylenol bottle sitting on the counter. She picked it up, counted the remaining capsules, and compared the number to what the bottle should have contained. 6 were missing. 1 for Adam, 2 for Stanley, 2 for Teresa. The math worked out, the timeline made sense, and suddenly a terrible hypothesis began to form. She contacted authorities. The remaining capsules were sent for analysis. And that's when a young investigator named Nick Pichos made a discovery that would change everything. When he opened the bottle and brought the capsules close to his face, he detected a faint odor. Almonds, the characteristic smell of cyanide. I need you to understand what cyanide does to the human body. It's one of the most efficient poisons known to science, a chemical that interferes with cellular respiration at the most fundamental level. When cyanide enters your bloodstream, it blocks your cell's ability to use oxygen. Your heart, your brain, your organs, they all depend on oxygen to function. And when that oxygen pathway is disrupted, everything begins to fail. The victim experiences chest pain, difficulty breathing, confusion. Their lips may turn blue. They may foam at the mouth, and then often within minutes they lose consciousness and die. The capsules from the Janus bottle were rushed to the Cook County Medical Examiner's office, where Chief Toxicologist Michael Schaffer confirmed the worst. 4 of the 44 remaining capsules contained lethal doses of potassium cyanide. Not just lethal doses, but massive overdoses, nearly 3 times the amount needed to end a human life. Someone had opened those capsules, poured out some of the medicine, replaced it with poison, and carefully sealed them back together. This was not an accident. This was not contamination at a factory. This was deliberate, calculated, intentional. The investigation expanded rapidly. Authorities began retracing the steps of every recent unexplained death in the Chicago area, looking for connections to Tylenol, looking for the thread that might connect these tragedies. And what they found was devastating. Mary Kellerman's death was re-examined. The bottle her father had retrieved from the medicine cabinet was tested. Cyanide. Then came the discovery of Mary McFarland, 31 years old, from Elmhurst. She had taken Tylenol at her office job just days earlier, complained of feeling strange, and collapsed. Her death had been attributed to natural causes, but when investigators tested the bottle from her workplace, they found cyanide. Paula Prince was next, a flight attendant, 35 years old, living in Chicago's Old Town neighborhood. She had returned from a trip, picked up a bottle of Tylenol, and died alone in her apartment. Her body wasn't discovered for several days. The bottle beside her tested positive for cyanide. And then there was Mary Lynn Reiner, 27, from Winfield. She had just given birth to her 4th child, was recovering at home, had taken Tylenol for post-delivery discomfort. She collapsed in front of her family. The bottle was tested. Cyanide. 7 people. 7 completely unconnected individuals. Different ages, different neighborhoods, different lives. A 12-year-old student. A postal worker. A newlywed couple. A young mother. A flight attendant. An office worker. The only thing they had in common was that they had all, in the span of a few days, reached for the same brand of pain reliever. And here's what made this case so terrifying, what separated it from every other poisoning case that had come before. There was no apparent motive. This wasn't a jealous spouse targeting a partner. This wasn't an employee with a grudge against a co-worker. This wasn't someone seeking insurance money or revenge or power. This was random. This was anonymous. This was someone who had decided to end the lives of strangers, people they had never met, people they would never see, people who meant nothing to them except as victims. When news of the poisonings broke, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Chicago erupted in panic. Police cruisers rolled through suburban streets with loudspeakers mounted on their roofs, broadcasting warnings that would become iconic images of the crisis. Do not take Tylenol until further notice. I repeat, do not take any Tylenol products. Imagine being a parent in those communities, hearing those words echo through your neighborhood while your children played in the yard. Imagine opening your medicine cabinet and seeing a bottle of Tylenol sitting there, suddenly transformed from a source of comfort into a potential instrument of death. Imagine not knowing whether the pills you'd taken yesterday, or last week, or this morning, might have been among the contaminated ones. The fear spread like wildfire. Pharmacies pulled Tylenol from their shelves. Hospitals issued warnings. News anchors led every broadcast with updates on the investigation. And across America, people began to wonder, if this could happen with Tylenol, what else could be contaminated? What else in their homes might be hiding something sinister? Johnson & Johnson, the pharmaceutical giant that manufactured Tylenol, faced an impossible situation. Their flagship product had become synonymous with terror. Every hour that passed without a resolution damaged their brand further. And yet, unlike many corporations faced with crisis, they made a decision that would be studied in business schools for decades to come. On October 5th, just days after the first deaths, they announced a nationwide recall of every bottle of Tylenol, 31 million bottles, over $100 million in losses. They didn't wait for government mandates. They didn't try to minimize or deflect. They pulled everything, everywhere, immediately. CEO James Burke appeared on national television, including a memorable segment on 60 Minutes, where he addressed the crisis directly. The message was clear. Consumer safety came before profits. The company would not rest until they understood what had happened and ensured it could never happen again. But even as Johnson & Johnson scrambled to respond, even as investigators worked around the clock, the fear continued to spread. Because the truth was, no one knew how many contaminated bottles were still out there. No one knew if the poisoner had stopped or was continuing their work. And no one knew whether Tylenol was the only target. In the weeks following the initial deaths, the FDA logged over 270 reports of suspected product tampering across the country. 36 of those were confirmed as genuine contamination events. Copycat criminals had emerged, inspired by the Tylenol case, eager to spread their own brand of terror. Halloween celebrations were cancelled in communities across America as parents feared that trick-or-treat candy might be poisoned. The trust that had defined consumer culture, the assumption that products on store shelves were safe, had been shattered. Let me pause here and speak directly to you for a moment. If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, if you're finding yourself drawn into these details, wondering what comes next, please take a second to hit that like button. Every like helps this video reach more people, helps more listeners discover the Midnight File, helps ensure that these stories continue to be told. 50 likes is our goal. Let's see if we can get there together. Now let's talk about the investigation. Because while the public was panicking and Johnson & Johnson was managing their crisis, law enforcement was working one of the most intensive cases in American history. The first major breakthrough came when investigators established that the tampering had not occurred at the manufacturing level. This was crucial. The contaminated bottles had come from two different Johnson & Johnson plants, one in Pennsylvania and one in Texas. If the poison had been introduced during production, it would have been concentrated in products from a single facility. But the geographic spread of the contaminated bottles proved that someone had purchased Tylenol from retail stores, introduced the cyanide after the fact, and then returned the poisoned bottles to shelves. 8 bottles in total were ultimately identified as containing cyanide in the Chicago area. 5 of these bottles were directly linked to the 7 deaths. The other 3 were either discovered on store shelves during the recall or turned in by consumers who had noticed something suspicious, perhaps a strange smell, perhaps capsules that looked slightly different, perhaps just a feeling that something wasn't right. The contaminated bottles had been purchased from locations spread across the Chicago suburbs: Frank's Finer Foods in Winfield, a Woolworths in Lombard, a Walgreens in Old Town, an Osco Drug in Schaumburg's Woodfield Mall, a Dominic's grocery store in Chicago proper. The geographic distribution suggested that the poisoner had been methodical, visiting multiple stores, perhaps over multiple days, planting their deadly cargo across a wide area. Think about what this would have required. The perpetrator would have needed to acquire potassium cyanide, a substance used in industrial applications like gold and silver refining, in jewelry making, in mining operations. They would have needed to purchase bottles of Tylenol, carefully open them without leaving evidence, empty some of the medicine from individual capsules, replace it with poison, reseal the capsules, replace the cotton wadding, close the bottles, and return them to store shelves, all without being observed, all without leaving fingerprints, all without triggering any suspicion. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't someone acting impulsively. This was calculated, deliberate, and patient. This was the work of someone who had thought carefully about what they were doing and had taken steps to avoid detection. The investigation involved hundreds of law enforcement personnel from local, state, and federal agencies. The FBI deployed resources typically reserved for major organized crime cases or terrorism investigations. Tips poured in by the thousands, each one requiring follow-up, each one potentially the break that would solve the case. And then, in early October, a letter arrived at Johnson & Johnson headquarters that seemed to change everything. The letter was handwritten, addressed to the company, and contained a demand for $1 million to stop the poisonings. It was signed with a name that would become infamous, Robert Richardson. But that name was fake, and when investigators traced the letter, they found their way to a man named James William Lewis. Lewis was a complicated figure, to say the least. He was 36 years old at the time, with a checkered past that included fraud charges and financial crimes. He had lived in the Chicago area, but had recently relocated to New York City with his wife. And the letter he sent to Johnson & Johnson contained details about the poisonings that had not yet been released to the public, details that only someone with intimate knowledge of the case should have known. Investigators descended on New York. Lewis was located and arrested, not for the poisonings themselves, but for extortion and fraud related to his threatening letter. And when they interrogated him, something strange emerged. Lewis could describe in detail exactly how someone would go about poisoning Tylenol capsules. He could explain the process step by step, demonstrating knowledge that seemed far too specific for an innocent bystander. But here's the thing, knowledge isn't the same as guilt. Lewis himself made this argument in a jailhouse interview years later. "I could tell you how Julius Caesar was ended," he said, "but that doesn't mean I was the one responsible." Lewis was convicted of extortion and served approximately 12 to 13 years in federal prison before his release in 1995. But despite being the primary suspect for over 4 decades, despite the circumstantial evidence, despite his own strange behavior and inconsistent statements, investigators were never able to definitively prove that James Lewis was responsible for the poisonings. In 2010, a judge ordered Lewis to provide DNA and fingerprint samples to investigators who were revisiting the case with modern forensic techniques. Lewis complied. His DNA was compared to genetic material recovered from the contaminated bottles, and it didn't match. James Lewis remained a person of interest until his death in July of 2023. In his final years, he gave interviews to documentary filmmakers, including those producing a Netflix series about the case. Those who interviewed him described moments when Lewis became defensive, even frightening, before reverting to his characteristic strange demeanor. But he maintained his innocence to the end, and with his death one of the strongest threads in the investigation was severed. But Lewis wasn't the only suspect. Let me tell you about Roger Arnold. Arnold was a Korean War veteran who worked as a dock worker at a Jewel Osco warehouse in Melrose Park, Illinois. When investigators began looking at people with connections to both the victims and potential access to cyanide, Arnold's name emerged. The circumstantial connections were troubling. Arnold possessed cyanide at his home, a substance with legitimate industrial uses, but certainly unusual for a private residence. He worked at a warehouse connected to the father of one of the victims, Mary Reiner. Psychiatric literature and firearms were found in his possession, suggesting possible mental health issues, and his wife had received psychiatric treatment at Central DuPage Hospital, which happened to be located directly across the street from Frank's Finer Foods, where one of the contaminated bottles had been purchased. But circumstantial evidence is not proof. And when Roger Arnold's DNA was eventually tested against samples from the crime scene, it did not match. He was cleared as a suspect. Arnold has since passed away, taking whatever secrets he might have held to the grave. The investigation also considered the possibility that the tampering might have occurred at a Johnson & Johnson facility after all, despite the evidence suggesting retail-level contamination. Some investigators theorized that a disgruntled employee might have found a way to poison products from different production runs, creating the appearance of retail tampering while actually operating from within. But this theory was never substantiated, and no employee was ever charged. Over the years, other names emerged and were investigated. Each one seemed promising for a time. Each one ultimately led to a dead end. The case files grew thicker, the evidence grew colder, and the identity of the poisoner remained a mystery. If you've been with me this far, if you're feeling the frustration that investigators must have felt, the desperate need to find answers that seemed just out of reach, then you understand why this case has haunted American consciousness for over 40 years. And if you want to be notified when I release the next file, when I dive into another case that demands to be remembered, make sure you're subscribed to the Midnight File. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Let me talk now about why this case proved so difficult to solve. Why, despite the massive resources deployed, despite the thousands of tips, despite the best efforts of some of America's finest investigators, the poisoner was never brought to justice. First, there was the almost complete absence of physical evidence. The perpetrator left virtually no fingerprints on the contaminated bottles. They deposited no biological material that could be tested. They created no surveillance footage, no witness accounts, no paper trail connecting them to the purchases. In an era before ubiquitous security cameras, before DNA profiling became standard, before digital receipts tracked every transaction, it was possible to commit a crime and leave almost nothing behind. Second, there was the randomness of the targeting. Most homicides are solved because investigators can identify a motive, a connection between perpetrator and victim. Jealousy, greed, revenge. When you know why someone would want another person gone, you can work backward to identify who had that motive. But in the Tylenol case, there was no apparent motive. The victims had no connection to each other. They weren't targeted because of who they were, but simply because they happened to purchase the wrong bottle at the wrong time. This randomness made profiling the perpetrator extraordinarily difficult. Third, there was the possibility of unknown victims. This is one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Cyanide poisoning can mimic other causes of death, particularly in older victims or those with pre-existing health conditions. A heart attack, a stroke, sudden cardiac failure. If someone died after taking contaminated Tylenol but their death was attributed to natural causes, they might never have been identified as a victim. Some investigators and documentary makers have theorized that the actual death toll might be higher than 7, that other victims might be buried in cemeteries across Chicago, their connection to the poisonings never discovered. Fourth, there were the limitations of 1982 technology. DNA profiling was in its infancy. The sophisticated forensic techniques we take for granted today simply didn't exist. Evidence that could be analyzed now might have been lost or degraded before modern methods became available. By the time technology caught up to the case, decades had passed, witnesses had died, and the trail had grown cold. And finally, there was the possibility that the perpetrator was simply better than the investigators, more careful, more patient, more willing to plan. If the poisoner truly was a stranger to all the victims, truly had no connection to them, truly committed the crime for reasons that defied conventional understanding, then perhaps they were simply too well hidden to ever be found. The tragedy sparked immediate legislative action that would reshape American consumer culture forever. In May of 1983, Congress passed the Federal Anti-Tampering Act, making it a federal crime to maliciously tamper with consumer products. The penalties were severe, reflecting the seriousness with which lawmakers viewed this new category of terror. The first person convicted under this new law was Stella Nickel, a woman from Washington state who poisoned Excedrin capsules with cyanide in 1986, 4 years after the Chicago tragedy. Her victims were her own husband, Bruce, whose life insurance she sought to collect, and an innocent stranger named Sue Snow who happened to purchase a contaminated bottle. Nickel had placed additional poisoned bottles on store shelves to make her husband's death appear to be the work of a mass poisoner, directly modeling her crime on the Tylenol case. She was convicted and sentenced to 90 years in prison, a reminder that the Chicago poisoner's methods had created a blueprint that others would follow. In 1989, the FDA established national requirements for tamper-resistant packaging on all over-the-counter products. Johnson & Johnson pioneered the triple safety seal design that became the industry standard. A glued box, a plastic seal over the bottle neck, and a foil seal over the bottle mouth. These 3 barriers were designed to make tampering virtually impossible without leaving visible evidence. Today we take these protections for granted. We don't think twice about the sealed boxes, The shrink wrap, the foil barriers, the click mechanisms that indicate whether a bottle has been opened. But all of these innovations trace back to those terrible days in September and October of 1982. All of them exist because 7 people in Chicago died from taking a common pain reliever. The Tylenol case created copycat crimes that extended the shadow of terror for years. In 1986, approximately 4 years after the original poisonings, a young woman named Diane Ellsroth died in Yonkers, New York, after taking cyanide-laced Tylenol from a bottle that should have been tamper-proof. The new packaging had been introduced. The seals were in place. And yet someone had still managed to introduce poison. The case suggested either that the original perpetrator had struck again, or that a copycat had found a way around the new protections. The Stella Nickel case in Washington state demonstrated the full horror of copycat crimes. Inspired by media coverage of the Tylenol poisonings, Nickel deliberately mimicked the methodology, hoping to disguise her husband's targeted elimination as a random act of mass poisoning. She killed an innocent woman in the process, a stranger who had nothing to do with her scheme, whose only crime was reaching for the wrong bottle on the wrong day. These incidents showed that the Tylenol case had achieved a dark kind of cultural significance. It had proven that such crimes were possible. It had provided a template for those who wished to spread terror, and it had demonstrated that even with new protections in place, the threat could never be completely eliminated. In recent years, the case has experienced a renaissance of attention. The Arlington Heights Police Department, which has never closed the investigation, initiated new DNA testing in 2023 using advanced technology from companies like Othram, which specializes in extracting usable genetic material from degraded or minimal biological samples. Investigators expressed cautious optimism that modern techniques might finally crack the case that had remained cold for over 4 decades. Netflix released a documentary series in 2024 and 2025 titled Cold Case, covering the Tylenol tragedy. The 3-part series featured interviews with FBI agents, police detectives, family members of victims, journalists who covered the original case and notably James Lewis himself, recorded before his death. It marked the first time Lewis had agreed to an extended on-camera interview about the poisonings, and filmmakers noted his strange behavior, his moments of defensiveness that bordered on frightening, his inconsistent demeanor throughout the conversations. The documentary also raised alternative theories that had been somewhat overshadowed by the focus on Lewis. Could the poisoning have occurred at a Johnson & Johnson manufacturing facility after all? Could there be another perpetrator who had escaped scrutiny entirely? The questions remained open, the answers still elusive. I want to share something with you now, something about what this case means, not just as a criminal investigation, but as a moment in American history. Before September of 1982, there was a kind of innocence in American consumer culture. We trusted the products on our shelves. We trusted the companies that made them. We trusted that when we opened a bottle of medicine or a package of food, we could assume it was safe. That trust was foundational. It was assumed. It was never questioned. The Tylenol poisoning shattered that trust in ways that can never fully be repaired. They showed us that everyday objects could be transformed into weapons. They showed us that strangers could target us without reason, without warning, without any hope of understanding. They showed us that the systems designed to protect us, the corporations, the regulators, the law enforcement agencies, could fail in ways that cost innocent lives. Every tamper-proof seal you see today is a monument to that lost innocence. Every piece of shrink wrap, every foil barrier, every safety mechanism exists because someone proved that we need them. And while these protections have made us safer, they also serve as constant reminders of what we lost, what we can never fully get back. The families of the 7 victims have carried this burden for over 4 decades. The Kellermans, who gave their daughter a simple remedy for a cold and watched her collapse hours later. The Janus family, who lost 3 members in a single day, whose grief-gathering became a death sentence for 2 more young people. The McFarlanes, the Princes, the Reiners, all bound together by a tragedy they never asked for, connected by a perpetrator they never knew. And the perpetrator. Who were they? What drove them to commit these acts? Were they motivated by some twisted ideology, some grudge against society, some psychological compulsion that defied understanding? Or were they simply someone who wanted to see what would happen, who wanted to watch the world react, who wanted to prove they could do something terrible and get away with it? We may never know. The case remains open, but with each passing year, the likelihood of resolution diminishes. Witnesses die, evidence degrades, memories fade, and the poisoner, if they're still alive, grows older, perhaps confident that their secret will go with them to the grave. James Lewis, before his death, once said something that has stayed with investigators and journalists for decades. When asked about the possibility that the true perpetrator was still out there, still free, still unknown, Lewis replied with words that were either haunting confession or darkly ironic observation. They could still be dancing in the streets. Think about that for a moment. Somewhere in America, perhaps still in the Chicago suburbs, perhaps far away, someone may be living their life with the knowledge of what they did. They may have families now, grandchildren perhaps. They may be pillars of their community, respected and admired. They may look at tamper-proof packaging every time they visit a pharmacy and feel whatever they feel about their legacy. Pride, guilt, indifference, we have no way of knowing. Or perhaps they're long dead, their identity buried with them, the truth lost forever to time and silence. Before I close this file, I want to speak directly to you one more time. This story, this case, these 7 lives cut short, they deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be discussed. They deserve to be shared with others who might never have heard their names. If this video has moved you, if it's made you think, if it's made you feel something about the fragility of safety and the persistence of injustice, please share it with someone else. Post it to your social media. Send it to a friend who loves true crime or documentary content. Help these stories reach the people who need to hear them. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the Midnight File. We're working toward 100 subscribers, building a community of people who believe that some stories are too important to be forgotten. Every subscription helps. Every like helps. Every comment helps. Speaking of comments, I want to know where you're watching from. Are you in Chicago, perhaps driving past these same suburbs where 7 people took their last breaths? Are you on another continent, discovering this case for the first time? Drop a comment below and tell me. I read everyone, and I'm always amazed by how far these stories travel. How many corners of the world are listening when midnight arrives? The Tylenol poisonings of 1982 remain one of America's most infamous unsolved cases. 7 victims, 0 convictions, 40+ years of investigation, and still, in the end, only questions. Who did this? Why did they do it? How did they manage to evade one of the largest investigations in American history? Are they still out there, still watching, still keeping their secret? These are the questions that haunt the families, that haunt the investigators, that haunt anyone who has ever reached for a bottle of medicine and felt, for just a moment, a flicker of doubt. In the words I often return to when these files weigh heavy on my mind, every town keeps a secret. Some just bury them deeper than others. This has been The Midnight File. I'm Julian Cross. And the next file is waiting. Sleep well if you can. Before I release you back into the night, let me leave you with one final thought. Mary Kellerman was 12 years old. She had a sore throat. Her father loved her enough to try to help her feel better. And in that simple act of care, in that gesture that parents make 1,000 times without thinking, everything was taken from her.